we have Mimi Ito and Angela McFarlane, and Angela will start. They'll each give a relatively short presentation. I want to leave ample time for interaction with the audience because I think that's very important in panels. If there's a little time left, I may say something, but I'm certainly going to forego saying anything to leave as much time as possible for the audience to ask questions and to interact with the panel. So we're going to start with Angela, and then we'll move to Mimi.
Okay. I hate wearing these things. I always feel I should be running an aerobics class, which I'm even less prepared to do than I am to talk about games and learning. Okay, I'm just going to try and give you a brief snapshot of some of the stuff that's happening in the UK at the moment, and then hopefully give you some hooks that you might want to explore during the Q&A. I think it's possible to identify 3 centres of interest in the relationship between games and learning, all of which will be very familiar to you. The first is the use of off-the-shelf games in the classroom. The second is using what we know about successful games to inform software design in the education sector. And the third one is looking at the models of learning in and around games play and using those models to inform learning models for the formal sector. Now, those 3 things interlink in all sorts of ways, but I think it's possible to identify those 3 themes, and I'm going to say a little bit about each of them. And I'm going to start with some information that came out of some survey work that we did that was actually published a couple of years ago now from the team report. And some of you may know this report. Doug Lowenstein did refer to it last year. It has had some coverage over here. But I thought it would still be worth offering a few remarks on that. And the other thing, which I'm not going to say very much about, but I would definitely recommend you go and have a look at John's website. My colleague John Kirimio does an ongoing survey of use of off-the-shelf software in the classroom, and he updates that, and he's just recently produced a new update on his website, and if you were at the Serious Games event, you may have heard him speak about that. And his work is very unusual because as far as we can make out, no one else is doing that kind of collection of actual practical examples from the classroom. One of the things that remains constant with that, which you'll remember if you've ever heard John speak, is the fact that most of the teachers don't want their names used in the research. I mean, you know, which is both funny and incredibly sad, because they really don't want people knowing that they're using video games in their classroom because they don't need the heat, basically. Okay, so the data I'm going to talk about, we collected data from nearly 800 kids, actually, and we had 33 classroom-based evaluations of different pieces of off-the-shelf software, which we categorized into different genres. We had 56 evaluations based on questionnaires and interviews with parents, and we also collected data from teachers. So we had 3 very different perspectives, that of the teacher, that of the parent, and that of the child, on the role of games in their learning. And I'm just going to pick out some of the headlines here, and starting with the parents' perspective. What was quite interesting is that these parents, clearly were not random. They had agreed to be part of this project, so they clearly didn't regard video gaming as, or video games as a spawn of Satan. So, they were moderately favourable, but they were very clear that kids playing games did directly support subject-based learning in schools. And surprise, surprise, you can see here from this graph, particularly their maths, their spelling, and their reading. Okay, so you immediately get a picture of the kind of games the parents think the kids are playing, okay, and their idea of what a video game might be. And then if you have a look at the kind of skills the parents think their kids are developing, then it becomes a bit more interesting, because these are parents who both observe their children playing games and talk with their kids about their games play. And that almost certainly makes them unusual as well, by the way, which is unfortunate. But they are firmly convinced that through their gameplay, the kids are developing better skills in decision making, in design, in strategy construction, in cooperation, in problem solving, okay? Now these are things that those of us who believe gaming is valuable know. But what I think is quite interesting about this is actual data from parents. You know, this isn't speculation in the media, this isn't somebody's view from having watched their own child. This is a reasonable sample of parents who are coming up with these views. So they're not, you know, they're not that off the wall, and we do have some evidential basis for them. Okay. Now, the parents came up with a whole range of things which they felt were going on. But these were two things that stood out. Now, these data were originally published in 2002, which is not that long ago. But up until that point, the media view in the UK of gaming was very firmly still. Gaming is about solitary, desocialized kids who play on their own and have no communication skills. Okay. Now this report in the UK got a lot of media exposure. Okay, I don't ever want to have that kind of media exposure again personally, but you know, it was in everything. It was on women's magazines, programs, it was everywhere. And it has quite subtly changed policy thinking about gaming, because suddenly it became acceptable for policymakers to be suggesting that, well, actually maybe there are elements of gaming that aren't that bad. And these two things I think were key. Firstly, everyone, the kids and the parents, were saying that kids prefer to play games with someone else. So the view of gaming moved from being solitary to being social, and the notion that talking about games and play was as important as playing the game, both to the parents and to the teachers. And you know, these are the first data, and these have very much informed the thinking about the relationship between games and learning in the UK from that point onwards. Okay, then what do the kids say they're learning? Well, of course, any child who likes gaming will tell you that playing games helps them to learn, just as every child will tell you that using a computer helps them with their schoolwork. Okay. You know, that's a given. Whether or not they really believe it is a different issue, but they know that's the right answer. But when you begin to kind of unpick it a bit, okay, we have this strange system where we chunk kids by age in the UK system, hence these slightly strange age bands. But predominantly in the 11 to 14 age group, working as a team came out. And again, this social element, which really surprised people who were reading this report. They just hadn't realized what a social activity gaming is, even, of course, if you actually physically play the game on your own. The kids in the 14 to 16 age range felt that it really helped them with their decision making, with planning, and with working as a team as well. And the 7 to 11, so these are kind of the upper elementary kids, also believed that playing their games did help them with their school subject and general knowledge. But the older kids, the 11 to 16-year-olds, did not see that as being the case. So, I think what we're seeing here is quite a distinct difference between the kinds of games that the younger kids played more frequently than the older kids. And that disjuncture between school-based valid knowledge and game-based valid knowledge in the 11 to 16 emerged as one of the issues, which won't surprise you a bit later on. Now, what also interests us, these were the views of the teachers. Now again, these teachers cannot be taken as typical. They had agreed to be part of this project. So they had agreed to use games in their classroom if they weren't already doing that. In fact, none of them were already using games. But they were also unusual because they were, if you like, power users of technology in their classrooms. They were part of the wider project of which this game survey was a part, teachers evaluating educational multimedia. So they really did know about using educational multimedia with kids, and they were much better prepared to take on the use of games than a teacher you might pick at random. But having used the games in the classroom, the things again that came out about the value of the activity were around the issues of discussion and collaboration. And this last point, losing arguments gracefully, was one that really surprised us. But several of the teachers noticed this, and then others started picking up on it. Where you had kids, particularly younger kids or kids who found social activity difficult, they often found negotiating around a game considerably easier than they found having any kind of discussion or conflict of ideas in other contexts. And one of the reasons for this is that if you're arguing about whether or not something is going to happen in the game, and then you do it, okay, the argument is settled. Okay, if you say, we have to press the red button now, no, we have to press the green, you can't argue about this indefinitely. You press one of the buttons and something happens, and it's either what you thought was going to happen or it isn't what you thought was going to happen. So what was happening with these kids was they were beginning to learn to negotiate for their ideas around the gaming space, because the feedback they were getting from the game was quickly stopping the argument escalating and giving them an answer. And so there was a concentration then on kids who had those kinds of difficulties with communication, and helping them to develop those skills. So that was one that we really hadn't been expecting. That was a nice extra one. Okay, now the reason we started doing this piece of work was because hands up, we did believe that there was a role for games in formal education, but we knew we needed the data to persuade other people of that point. And we were sufficiently convincing that we did persuade our Ministry of Education to put some money into this funding, largely because at the time, David Putnam, who you may have heard of, because he's the only Brit ever to have run a Hollywood studio. He ran Columbia. He's the guy behind films like Chariots of Fire. And he's now a major player in education policy in the UK. And he firmly believed that we should be investing, as a country, the government should be investing in research around games and learning. And the policymakers were not at all convinced about this, so they wanted some evidence. So that's one of the reasons they put money into this piece of research, to find out whether or not there really was an argument here. So some of the things that fell out of this about why it's so difficult to use computer games in the school are up here. And again, there are no real surprises in here. But one of the things that didn't come out of the report at the time, but has emerged subsequently, is of course one of the major difficulties with games or with any other software environment in the classroom is the black box nature of the game. Okay, so if you're, when you're trying to manage what's happening in a classroom, okay, you normally have some kind of insight into what is actually happening. You can either go and sit in with a group and listen to their discussion, or you can go to an individual child and you can flick back through the work that they're doing in some way, and you can see what's happening. Okay, and that's true whether or not they're working in an exercise book or whether or not they're building something on screen. You have some kind of shared external representation of what's been happening during the lesson. Now, as soon as you move away from that shared view, you have difficulties as a teacher, because suddenly you only have the latest screen sitting on the machine in front of you, and you don't know what they're doing. And that induces two things. Firstly, in a lot of teachers, it induces a lot of insecurity, because you're worried that they're not really doing what they're supposed to be doing. But the other thing is, it really does disable you as a facilitator of learning, because if you can't come and intervene in the process and ask the good questions, which is actually what is the essence of being a good teacher, is knowing when and what to ask to help move the learning on, then you are disabled, in much the same way that Henry talked about having to, what would happen if we had to go into a classroom without our glasses. If you're a teacher and you have no access to what is going on other than interrupting and talking to the kid, then you are significantly disabled. And that's not unique to games. There's an awful lot of educational software which is not welcome in the classroom for the same sorts of reasons. But that's one of the things that has come out in subsequent work, which didn't come out at the point of the report. But some of these other things are things that could easily be built into an off-the-shelf game to make it a lot more user-friendly in the classroom. Particularly this issue of being able to build preset scenarios and being able to save and restart easily from where you are when you have got 30 people using the thing simultaneously. Okay, and those sorts of features could very easily be built in. So there's a whole range of things that came out of the report that have been picked up. And things that also came out of the report that inform both education and educational games from these findings is some of the things that were highlighted. And again, this is not unique to this work by any stretch of the imagination, but it reminded people of the importance of challenge. That it's, no one likes games that are too easy. We know this. The importance of inference, the importance of not getting everything right first time, but being given chances to go back and try again. Now that seems such a simple thing, but in the school classroom, you rarely get the chance to really go back and try something again in a neutral way. Kids' most frequent example of going back and doing something again is when you got it so badly wrong, you have to do it again as some kind of punishment. Okay, so the idea that it's fine to get things wrong and you can just go back and start with a clean slate and try it all over again and do it differently, that's not a normal part of formal classroom work, and yet it's just standard practice in games. It's one of the major differences. The idea that you have something to talk about. The role of talk in learning, I think, is in a lot of education practice sadly neglected. And it echoes for me very much with the Bareiter and Scardamalia work from Toronto, that you have to talk about ideas. You have to instill with kids the notion that knowledge is not some strange thing that's out there, that knowledge is something that people make and people work with, and that kids can do that. And that's what learning is about. And so the talk that's going on around games is unlike the talk that goes on around other kinds of educational software. And there are lots of reasons for that we can maybe talk about later on. And there are a few other things here which I'm not going to go into detail on now, because I'm going to be here for hours otherwise. Now, that report was just one of the many things that fed into a kind of head of steam on the policy level that led the UK government to invest in something which became Nesta Future Lab. And they have a very, very good website and a series of research reviews and a range of development projects. Now, what Future Lab is it's a kind of pragmatic blue skies development organisation, if you can have such an oxymoron, in that they're dealing very much, I should say we are dealing very much with the kinds of projects which are looking at the next generation of technologies, but at the same time understanding the transitions that are required to move that technology into a formal learning context. And the way that Future Lab works is that several times a year it has a call for ideas, and it then selects the best ideas that come forward and works with those people to develop proof of concept prototypes. And I want to show you just one of those at the moment to illustrate some of the things that people are doing. I do have others, and if we have time we may have a look at them, but I want to show you a very scratchy piece of video, because this is something that is really not launched yet. And it's a program called Racing Academy. And Racing Academy looks an awful lot like a standard race game, as you will see. The difference about, there are several things that are quite different about Racing Academy. Firstly, when you play, the car actually feels and responds like a real car, which is not true of all racing games. But also, what's sitting behind Racing Academy is a real-world physics engine. And the algorithms have been built by engineers. So the car behaves like a real car. And sitting behind the software, you have a range of variables about the car that you can go in and you can play with. So you can set up your car in just the way that you would set up a car if you were designing a race car. So you'll see on the video, for example, you can go in and you can look at the torque graphs on for the engine. And you can actually manipulate those graphs to get the kind of torque profile you think is going to make your car outperform the others. And there are a series of levels through the game. It starts with a straight line speed trial, and it builds on to taking your car onto a racetrack. There is a community element to it. It has a discussion forum. Kids tend to work in teams when they work with this. And so it's building on some of those things we know about the way in which people learn, and learn in a collaborative and communal way when they are part of a games play community. Now, when I first saw this idea, I thought this is really great, and there's a certain kind of adolescent male who is going to love this game and is going to learn some physics and engineering. But you are never going to get an adolescent girl to play this game, okay? Wrong, completely wrong. Admittedly, the boys tend to like it more than the girls, but there are very significant numbers of the girls too who really got into this game and form part of that community and have learned a lot about motor engineering as a result. I don't know why I was so surprised by that, but I kind of learned something about my stereotyping as well. Because actually I rather like cars, but hey. Could we have a look at the video, please? And as I say, I apologise for the quality of this video, because I literally grabbed this off the guys before I ran out the door. Okay, so what's actually happening here now? These kids are playing the game as part of a physics class. These students are about 15 or 16 years of age. And as you can see, they're playing individually in terms of actually racing their cars. But one of the things that flashed up on there was actually the development forum, where they're exchanging information about car setups. And to set their car up, they're going and they're dealing with graphical data. There's an interesting element of graphical interpretation here as well. And as you can see, they're playing this on standard multimedia PCs, so they don't have a particularly nice interface for the racing. One of the things we want to do in the next stage of this is actually to run it with a joystick, so the actual racing experience is a bit more exciting. But having set their car up on the straight line speed trial, they then progress up to the next level and they can race their game. And what's coming up in between the screens are all the different data screens that they can get at to actually play around with the car setup. Now, all of these data are then accessible to their teacher. Okay, so there are several things about this game that make it that improve the comfort level for the teacher. Firstly, they know that the physics algorithms and the engineering terminology and data sitting behind this model are real world. So they don't have to worry that the kids are going to come away with a very strange notion about the importance of the mass of the engine, for example, because this is a true world model in that sense. The other thing about the game is that they know that the teacher knows at any one point who is doing what within the game, and the choices they make and the data they select to use does get stored. So you have some kind of record of what people have done, and you can then work with them on the problem-solving strategies that they've used in order to build their car. Okay, so there are built into this software several kind of teacher comfort issues that mean that this game is being very, very well received by physics teachers, whereas a standard racing game, no matter how good it is in terms of a game, no matter how lifelike it looks, no matter how brilliant the graphics are, they're not comfortable using those kinds of games because they can't be certain that they're going to behave in the way that real world cars behave, and you can't get any of the underlying physics or engineering behind them. Okay, so that's one of the examples of the kind of work that is coming out. I hope that that made some kind of sense. I'm trying to kind of link together about 5 years' work by about 100 people and make it sound coherent. So obviously, any questions people would like to ask, very happy to continue any of those conversations. Thanks.
Time for questions and comments for Angela or Mimi, or the world at large.
Okay, so I don't know. I have mic
Do you have?
one, and okay. So should I put on a different mic? Which one? This one. Okay. I'm getting an error on the. Is that? Okay. So, can you hear me? This one's working. Okay. So, what I'm going to be talking about today is about work that I did in Japan a few years ago, looking at children's play, specifically with post-Pokemon media mixes. I'll be focusing on Yu-Gi-Oh! Today. And I think a lot of what Henry and Angela have said about the social dimensions, the social interaction around gaming is a really nice lead up to some of the stuff I'm talking about, even though the domain that I'm working on is quite different, at least from the in-school context. I wanted to start by just framing a little bit about my research program and the perspective that I'm bringing to the study of children's recreational gaming. So I'm an anthropologist, and I sort of do naturalistic studies of what kids do in their everyday life around technology use. I do have a degree in education, but I've never studied play within educational institutions. So instead, my research is much more on the learning side rather than the education side, if you think of education as educational institutions and academic content. So, and I think that distinction is important in a lot of ways, not because I want to say that the kids who are doing recreational play are not having educational experiences, but instead that the institutionalization of learning does matter, and that non-institutionalized, informal forms of learning have unique social properties, which we've been calling learning off the record. So this is learning that's a byproduct of engagement with things, rather than learning as an explicit outcome of a designed activity, and that these sort of peer-to-peer social dynamics outside of educational institutions have a certain dynamic to them, which is what I'm trying to understand. And so a lot of what I think is unique about the social dynamics is the lateral kid-driven dimension of them, which makes my focus on those kid-to-kid interactions rather than person-to-game engagement, which is the focus of a lot of research on gaming. The other area that makes my work a little bit different from, I think, the mainstream of gaming research is that my work with kids media is part of a broader research program looking at personal and portable media forms like mobile phones and trading cards and Game Boys and things like that, and looking at Japan as kind of a context that has incubated some of these types of media. So my question is really to try to understand what's happening to media engagement as it migrates from large screens viewed in stationary locations like the office or the home or the movie theater to small handheld screens and objects like trading cards that occupy users at much more diverse settings of play. So how can we understand that hybrid ecology between these big screens and little screens and this media that's migrating into much more pervasive locations? Okay, so do I have to introduce Yu-Gi-Oh? Does everybody know? Okay. So it's, I assume that most of you are around kids and you caught the wave of Yu-Gi-Oh fever. I was doing field work in 99 to 2001 in Tokyo, which was really the peak of the Yu-Gi-Oh craze in Japan. And it was popular here in Japan to give you, it reached, in Japan when things catch on from a certain point, they really reach close to 100% saturation, which is what happened with Yu-Gi-Oh! So it really became the dominant imaginary economy around children for a certain period of time. It was more boy dominant than what we saw with Pokemon, but even among girls, at least one survey of a school showed that 100% of the students owed some Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, so girls obviously were buying them, although they were less avid players than boys. So I'm presenting Yu-Gi-Oh! As a case that's probably somewhat marginal to the mainstream of at least US electronic gaming, in that the central activity was really the card game, or more accurately, it was the entire media mix, of which electronic gaming was one component. So the media mix has some unique properties, or the Japanese animation-oriented media mix, in that it's really an integrated strategy. Like Pokemon was kind of an experiment in it, but now it's much more consciously designed. It is an integrated strategy where you're seeing a single content form manifest into multiple media forms concurrently, and they feed into each other in real time. It's different, obviously, from the sequential process of translation that we've more traditionally seen between different media types. And I think what's interesting about the Japanese versions of the media mix is the fact that the portable media forms are so central to how they're experienced by kids. And then the other property of the media mix that's interesting is that because there's a range of types of engagement, that different age groups can engage and enter the media mix at different points. So with Pokemon, as you probably know, the Game Boy game was really central to the gaming experience. With Yu-Gi-Oh! It was really the card game. So you'll see what's interesting about the Yu-Gi-Oh! Narrative and where it differs from Pokemon is that the players are playing a card game. They don't have monsters like with Pokemon. They are playing the card game. So the characters in the manga and anime series are engaging in exactly the same activities that our real world kids are engaging in. So it's a much closer mapping. So you have scenes of kids, characters in the manga going out and collecting cards and going to card shops and things like that, which are all things that kids are doing in real life. So it kind of, Yu-Gi-Oh! Sort of pushed that media mix equation further along in a lot of ways. So, I don't know, for those of you who have never played Yu-Gi-Oh!, it was originally released as an easy-to-play version of Magic: The Gathering. It was derivative of Magic in a lot of ways, although it evolved into something that was unique. But because it was released that way, you know, they would continue to release the booster packs and things like that every few months, and it developed this sort of complex, layered gameplay, not necessarily by design, because they were adding and changing rules as they went along. Now, so the gameplay is incredibly complex. The other dimension is the card trading and valuation that the kids get into. So I'm guessing that most people are familiar with how card games get released. So most card packs are, I think here they're released in slightly larger units, but in Japan you get 4 cards, and most of the cards, you don't know what you're getting in the card pack, and most of the cards have normal cards. But if you're lucky, you might get a rare, an ultra rare, a super rare, an ultimate rare, or maybe even a secret rare card in one of your card packs. So of course this fuels this collection mentality that, at least in the Pokemon era, was considered problematic here and led to a lot of moral panics around youth entrepreneurism, and it was obviously a problematic subjectivity for children to be engaging in activist economic exchange. So this was, you know, a big problem because it was disrupting our idea of what appropriate childhood behavior was, and I think the same thing is true for Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, when you watch actual gameplay, you know, the general process of gameplay is one-on-one, where duelists are pitting like magic and trap cards against each other. But what's interesting is that the player-level customization is really built into the structure of gaming in the case of card gaming. So every kid creates their own personal card deck and develops a personal style of play. So a lot of kids will say, oh, probably with Pokemon, it was like the water creature deck or whatever, that kids had their unique identifications, and so you have to customize and develop a personalized viewpoint on the content in order to play at all. So I've been describing this sort of dynamic of gameplay as hypersociality, and that kids are using these extremely dense set of signifiers and imaginary worlds to traffic in cultural capital, or whatever you want to call it. It becomes the coin of the realm for which kids develop their social relationships with each other. So like the other discussion we've already had about how gaming is a very inherently social activity, media mixes kind of push this dynamic to the forefront, that the social life is dependent upon these dense set of signifiers. And I think it's moving towards a vision of children's consumption that's becoming more extroverted, more outdoors, more activist, differentiated, entrepreneurial. It's really going against the model of passive, solitary, indoor engagement with media. Now, of course, not all kids are engaging it within this way, but it does provide an alternative figure for how media consumption by kids might be conceptualized. So from a learning perspective, Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game play is really grounded in the premise that learning is happening in a group social setting rather than as a relation between a child and text. So people are not assuming that kids are going to sit down with the game by themselves and learn how to use it, unlike a lot of how standalone gaming is defined. Now, obviously, with more complex electronic gaming, the trend is also towards assuming that there will be a lot of player-level exchange in order for gameplay to be able to happen. Now, anybody who's tried to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Can tell you that it's almost impossible to figure out the rules without the coaching of a more experienced player. Just as context, my research assistants and I tried to learn the game. We bought the rule book, we got the instructional videotape, we were dueling against each other, we didn't get it at all. It was only after the coaching of some elementary age kids and then some patient coaching by some more professional collectors that we sort of got the basics, but we weren't even close in terms of understanding the intricacies of how card game exchange and valuation. So we really didn't know if we should trade a Blue Eyes White Dragon for a Thunderbolt. I mean, that was sort of a level of knowledge that was extremely difficult and required a deep investment in the peer-to-peer exchange and knowledge economy around this stuff. Okay, so I think I've already said this. I'm going to try to keep it quick. So what's interesting, the other dynamic that's interesting about these media mix series is that it's something like Yu-Gi-Oh!, unlike Magic, was really released as child-oriented content. And yet, like most other kinds of deep anime-oriented media mixes, it attracts a wide following of adult fans. And there's this very interesting set of intergenerational dynamics that are being supported by this. So I just want to give you a few quick examples of what has come to be known otaku-like forms of engagement. I think the term has gotten popular over here. These fans take the remix and alternative cultural production dimension of these media content even further, to the point where they're really pushing back against the normative structures of commodity capitalism. In other words, annoying the companies that create the content. So one example is what came to be known as sachi, or searching. It was derivative of the English term searching, which are the methods by which card collectors figure out which are rare card packs before purchase. So I went out on a search round with a group of card collectors. They know the day the new card packs are going to be released, and they also know which convenience stores put the cards out on their shelves the night before the official release date. So we went to a particular neighborhood and searched and cleared one neighborhood of all the rare card packs in the neighborhood before the run-of-the-mill consumers start coming. Now, for the shopkeeper's point of view, they were a little bit amused and reluctant, but they can be talked into it because they're going to sell the card packs anyway. But then what happens is that the collectors will figure out the patterns around this technique, and they'll post on their websites how to identify rare card packs. So it becomes this peer-to-peer, this local sort of peer-to-peer knowledge that gets disseminated widely over the internet, and then the industry responds and tries to correct it, but it's this constant sort of pushing back and give and take. And professional card collectors like this, I mean, they will purchase hundreds of rare card packs and could easily make a living off of trafficking in rare cards, because there's a secondary economy where the traders sell single card packs over the internet or at specialty card shops and things like that. And there have been attempts by Konami to crack down on this, but of course it's extremely difficult to do so. They try to do it in roundabout ways, like prohibiting certain card game teams for participating in official tournaments and things like that. But basically, it's this viral process that really can't be policed that well. It's dominated by women, although more and more men are getting, boys are getting involved. And it basically is, production value-wise just as well done in many cases as professionally produced content, and yet the narratives are things that would not be released over professional networks, official commodity networks. So just to give you a sense of the scale, the comic market is the largest convention in Japan, and it's run twice a year. It's all peer-to-peer amateur comic exchange. 300,000 people show up twice a year. So it's millions and millions of dollars being exchanged that's not tracked by mainstream economic indicators at all. So very similar in terms of the alternative economic dynamic with the trading card traffic, the gray market trading card traffic. This is just for fun. So whenever you go to a comic market or a game show, there's always the kids that dress up. So it's part of like this general process of different ways of materializing this fantasy world into kids' lives. And, the costume play is sort of one of the more spectacular versions of that. Okay. So I've tried to give you some examples of, the sorts of hyper-social exchange, the alternative economies that kids are increasingly having access through media that are designed to allow particular forms of engagement. This form of engagement, it appropriates corporate media and infrastructures, and yet it really uses it as a source of imagination for creating value and reputation inherent to the community. There's no external assessment measures and sorting institutions associated with this kind of learning. It's really about reputation that's being built within the peer-to-peer networks. There's sort of a sense of independent production, and there's not an automatic equation between age and expertise. So I know the otaku practices I described may seem a little bit far out and marginal to what mainstream kids are doing, and yet if you look at how even regular kids are engaging with Yu-Gi-Oh cards, they really traffic in the same sorts of knowledge and objects as the peer-to-peer otaku networks, although the rumor mill isn't as well informed. So all of the kids I talked to knew about search techniques, although they didn't actually know how to do them. A lot of them had visited card shops or looked at card prices on the internet. And all of them trade cards among one another, and they often look to the websites to determine which ones are valued more highly. And part of the reason why I think kids are so animated around content like Yu-Gi-Oh! Is it does represent a more agentive view of childhood, and it provides a space for kids to learn and gain expertise in a peer learning community that's not being evaluated by adult standards, particularly adults who have power over them. So there are adults in the community, but these are peers. They're not people who are evaluating their expertise in a top-down perspective. And so the adults participate with kids as equals at the duel table, and often elementary kids will beat adults when they're doing a Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel. Age doesn't automatically determine expertise. So like you see in the sort of mix on the internet, these fan cultures are really intergenerational learning communities, and they're reliant on the large institutionalized processes of media producers, but they're not governed by their logic. So I guess in conclusion, and this is sort of my raising questions for discussion, hopefully, is that what I've gotten really interested in is sort of this idea of amateur cultural production that's built through these intermediary zones. So like you see with the Yu-Gi-Oh fans and the fanzines historically, it's really about the appropriation of reshaping of knowledge and culture produced at influential sites of global cultural production. And the learning happens through engagement with these global forums, but also importantly through local engagement with informed peers. So it's not the casual engagement of the everyday consumer that we associate with like kids engaging with television content, but it's a much more deeper form of engagement that produces alternative forms of knowledge and unique social networks and practices. So in other words, these are expert communities, even though they're not professional communities. And I think that distinction is really important. So this is my last slide. And I'm trying to just, and I'd like input on this because this is sort of what I'm actively working on. So if we're going to place these amateur practices along sort of a global to local scale that contrasts large-scale cultural production and individual-scale cultural consumption on one end, you can see that they kind of lie in this intermediary zone, what we call associated with the connoisseur or the amateur. So in this domain, cultural content is being exchanged and engaged with at a scale that's larger than the intimate and personal stuff, like just IMing your friends. It's something more than that. And yet, it's not at the scale of mass media transmission. It's not, some of these amateur products get, wide circulation, but most of them happen among peer networks. So this is the scale of maybe a dozen to several hundred people where there's some kind of named relation between participants, and leadership and reputation arises organically within the communal context. So it's not the faceless exchange that you get when you buy a book or you buy a video game, but it's more like the exchange you'd get among a hobby group and local communities. So this kind of exchange is nothing new, and in fact there's been a lot of educational research that has tried to do apprentice-like learning for educational settings, but somehow I feel like these digital networks are making it more prevalent and easier to facilitate these kinds of exchanges. Obviously, among the gaming community, things like game mod constructions, machinima, these are all activities that occupy, I think, a similar social structural zone. But what I think is interesting about the Yu-Gi-Oh cases, the Yu-Gi-Oh trading card case, is that you see these same dynamics among a very, very broad base of participation in youth culture. So the barriers to entry are much lower with trading card games. So I think you have to be fairly far along to be able to design your own game mods and things like that. But to be able to create your own trading card deck, that's what every elementary age kid in Japan did during a period of a few years. So I think it is about the broadening of this kind of dynamic that's been around for a long time. So I just want to end with a final question, which is what would it take to legitimize these kinds of social interactions, this sort of domain of amateur production as a legitimate space of educational and learning activity? Because in general, it tends to get ghettoized. It's sort of the domain of bake sales, otaku, stuff that is not considered really important, really leading to, what we should be doing is professional, assessment, professionalized standards, things like that. I'm trying to argue that there's actually something very valuable in the stuff that's sort of one step removed. Thank you.
Okay. All right, we have about 45 minutes left, and I do want to move to questions and comments. If you don't have anything to say, I can threaten you to talk myself, but I'm sure there's plenty to discuss with what we've just seen. So we're going to open the floor, and I'll call on people. And you were right there, so.
Well, I'm going to help bridge the Civilization 3 this is the first time I've attended anything like this. But I wanted to address your final question. You said, how could we legitimize this and bring it into a more formal setting and get people to take it more seriously? I think you kill it if you do that. I think the very reason the kids play this game is that it gets them away from their parents. It's not something their parents do. They do it. They have created their own decks. They get a sense of individuality out of it. As soon as you say, all right, now it's required of you to do this, they will not want to participate. And I think this is a general problem that we have with the serious game. Part of education, and kids don't want to do education basically. They want to have fun. They want to play games.
I just want to clarify. I wasn't suggesting that legitimizing necessarily meant bringing it into a school. So I think there may be my suggestion, and emotionally I agree with you. Basically, I was just at a two-day conference which was about bringing things like blogs and wikis into classroom context, for example. And then one of my favorite quotes from that was, but blogs are for fun. Yeah. It's sort of this dynamic that it becomes very difficult to appropriate the stuff that grew up organically in these youth networks and so I basically agree with you. I think the question more is that adults actively crack down on this stuff, right? And they see it as like negative and, disrupting the purity of childhood and things like that. And maybe there's a way that we can be a little bit more open to that.
Being more accepting of the fact that the kids are having fun. I think that we all agree that people are having fun and using their brains and solving problems that they are learning.
If I could comment on the Yu-Gi-Oh thing, there's a hidden, I'm a linguist, and there's a hidden virtue in Yu-Gi-Oh, which is also very pervasive in the United States. And it follows from this, that the biggest correlate for kids' success in school after they learn to decode, if you ask, once the kids learn to decode print, the biggest and most important variable is their vocabulary early in life, and not just their everyday vocabulary, but their ability to engage in specialized languages. Now, if you've ever read the back of a Yu-Gi-Oh card, a Yu-Gi-Oh site, the language is extremely complicated. I mean, it is just chock full of so-called school-based words. That is, the Latinate vocabulary, the complex languages, the conditional clauses. I mean, I invite you to go look at one of the cards, but bring your glasses. So one of the things that, it goes to what Henry said about an equity divide, because kids who are doing things like Yu-Gi-Oh and Digimon socially and through the internet are being exposed to extremely complicated language that builds outside of school the sorts of language and vocabulary skills that we know are very facilitatory towards school. And and this would be an ideal site for poor kids to get this, not in school, but in their peer culture. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. So from that point of view, I think that validating this, but not putting it into school, still gets you a huge benefit in school. And not doing it is going to create a new equity divide, because popular culture is so complex today. All right, I've been told to repeat the question, so I'll do that. Yes?
Hi, I'm David Kaufman. I'm the principal investigator for the Sage for Learning, the Canadian project. So I'd like to first of all compliment you on that wonderful game.
Oh, thank you.
You've given a lot to us. Thank you. But I'd also like to give another point of view about what you said, and maybe have Angela comment on it if we could. Your assumption is based on schools and educational institutions being the way they are, and therefore you put out two dichotomies. I think what we're saying is if we look at situations where kids are allowed to do things in schools that are fun, like, for example, rehearsal play or do something, they actually look forward to coming to do this together. So I think what some of us are looking at is to say, if we can somehow create a structure and a space for kids to be able to do this in the school system, then perhaps we could change kids' attitudes towards schools and towards education. I wonder what you have to say.
All right, did everybody hear that, or should I repeat it? Did you hear it? All right, well, the question is, about moving things into school. Can we move it into school in such a way that it is fun, and that therefore it energizes the motivation and energy that games have? Or is it true that that we cannot put this stuff into school? Can it rearrange school and make school fun? And Angela was asked to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a dilemma which I personally have not yet entirely resolved, because clearly this is not about appropriating children's personal life and personal space. And in the UK, that's something that we are genuinely very, very concerned about, some of us anyway, because what they're doing with a content-led model of the curriculum is packing more and more stuff in and then thinking, oh crikey, we can't possibly cover that in a school day, so how can we extend school into kids' out of school life, and how can we appropriate that space? Which some of us, and you'll gather from the way I put that point, I'm one of them, I'm very concerned about, that we don't give kids enough space to just be kids. And so the idea that appropriating their gaming activity and bringing that into the classroom as a way of taking over that space is something that worries me enormously. However, having said that, one of the things that also perplexes me is the way that the school system fails to recognize or validate any of that extremely advanced cognitive activity that is going on in kids' lives. And Henry's comment about the book, really made me smile, because we have, and I think you have something very similar here, that media education in certain elements of our society in Britain is definitely something that is completely a dumbing down of literature. Why on earth would you have children talk about the latest soap opera when they should be discussing Dickens? And and I think there's a similar element here, a failure to recognise just the sort of levels kids are operating at, in terms of knowledge and media awareness when they're playing games. So that's something that concerns me. So how can we recognise that within the school system that what they're doing is valid? Another element to this, I'm sorry, this is a bit kind of waffling, but I don't think there isn't a simple answer to this question. But another aspect of it that concerns me is that when kids choose to bring this aspect of their life into the classroom, it is not valued by their teacher. And this is not only about gaming. One of my favourite examples of this, is one of our researchers actually witnessed, was an elementary school child who came in with some printouts of his website. And he tried to show them to his teacher, and she said to him, "Yes, that's very nice, dear, but today we're doing cut and paste." And that just that little snippet just summarises for me this real issue. How do we recognise that these kids are a lot smarter than we give them credit for, in all kinds of things which we often are not familiar with, without at the same time colonising that space and ruining it for them? And I think that's a real challenge.
If I can add something to that, just a question, is if you don't ask the question about whether we should bring games into the classroom, but whether we should bring some of the features that games have, for example, that they're collaborative, that they involve a cycle of probing, hypothesizing, getting feedback, that they're lower risk. There's a whole bunch of features that both games and Yu-Gi-Oh culture, same thing. It has all the same features, by the way, of a game. In that sense, it is a game, regardless of how it's being played. And if you look at those features, some of those are quite transportable to classrooms without transporting the game, and improving education. Let's go here, and then we'll go straight back up. Deb?
I just wanted to share, just to address this issue that you talked about. We just released our new Pirates. And recognizing that the schools were fearful of the game, and that's a pretty benign product to the extent that, there's no violence in it. For years people have written about its applications in the classroom. So we actually flew Kurt Squire to Baltimore and had him do a workshop for a week in a school with Pirates. And we paid for it, for him to come and do it. And we got into the school by volunteering for Parent Education Week as parents, because our children go to that school. And so Kurt came in, and what's interesting is when he came in the classroom that first day, I went with him, and the technology teacher said, the kids cannot install the games themselves. Kurt and I had to install all the games. And we had a lot of trouble, and there was a very short amount of time, and then the kids started coming in, and some of the games were installed, and they started playing the games. She said, she took Kurt aside, and she said that children are not allowed to touch the computer. So she and he said, well, they know how to do it. Doesn't matter, we don't allow that, And then she took me aside and said, I'm not going to be helpful with this. Just made it clear that this was sort of aberrant. And then other kids wanted to come in. She said, she's very, you can't come in, the class hasn't started. To make a long story short, by the end of the week, she was really a champion. Because we had 14 middle school boys in that class. They also only allowed boys to register, even though girls had signed up. So they really followed into it, but I can't believe they took Kurt, aside. I was very much to ask him if he'd come back next year and do it. And so now they're just doing that game program. But I do think that that's a way to do it. We're a developer. It didn't cost, I think it was $2,500 to buy the game, fly it in. He was saying, I'm just saying that I do think that's where role developers can play in working with academics who I knew that, we knew he would deliver the game in such a way, he's an educator, that would be compatible with what was happening in the classroom, and it would scare them. And we didn't actually do any media related to that. Kurt had written himself about it, but our goal wasn't really media. It was to see for ourselves and to play a little bit of a role in seeing how we could make it happen. Now, I don't know how we could do every school in the country. It's a little case study there.
So the key question of how to prepare the ground, whether you're doing in the school, business, or in the military, for the people who are going to be the teachers and trainers, but who may themselves not be as comfortable with the technology as the children are. That could be a virtue. It can be made into a virtue if the kids become teachers. Okay, right there.
Hi, my name is Paul Toprak. I think the reason why you'll find difficulty in implementing this current age of accountability, games not being valued, is the fact that the teachers are being evaluated on this performance, are on performances of kids in short answer questions at the end of the school. And based on that, the whole NCLB thing here in the United States, I'm from Texas, so we're the ones that actually are driving the I don't know and that Intel, it can't be valued because learning from games is a higher order thinking. That's not what they're being tested on. And if I were a teacher, I would never allow games to be played because they don't teach the rote memorization required at the end of the school year to get to the next level. So until we can change that system, there is no way we're going to be able to drive games into education.
Okay, so the issue is the testing and accountability regime in schools is antithetical to introducing games for deep and conceptual learning. They won't be valued, and of course this is a big issue. I should point out that there is a new issue arising, though, with the government that will get a lot of grant money, and that's what has been referred to for 30 years as the fourth grade slump. And that is all the kids who were taught to read by skill and drill but can't read in middle school and past fourth grade to learn content. And it may and this is now a huge issue, middle school and high school, the kids not being prepared to learn content very deeply because we douse them in so much skill and drill. So it's possible this issue may change in the near future, but it has certainly been a big one about the current skill and drill culture of the schooling. Is that Mark way back there?
Yes, I'm Mark Kresge. I've been talking to a lot of teachers, trying to help them think about ways to put games in. And I want to sort of emphasize what Angela said about valuing what the kids do. Because there's one more category I think you can add, which may be implicit, which is just talking about games in class. Bringing the discussion and validating the fact that that's something. And a way that occurred to me, which I had never thought about, but suddenly said, where kids write book reports, why can't some of those reports be game reports or game reviews, which sounds a little better, where you encourage kids to verbalize about their games? And I've asked teachers about it, and very few of them have ever done it, but almost every single one of them thought it was a good idea.
Okay, so the point being that one way to bring games in the classrooms is through having the kids write and talk about them as media.
Can I respond
Yeah,
to that?
sure. Okay, Angela.
Well, because it also relates to Deb's point that I think one of the things that makes that kind of work difficult, again, is this black box nature. Because if a kid comes in and with a book that isn't one of the agreed texts and says, I want to write a report on this book, well, a teacher can pretty quickly, in a couple of minutes or less, assess whether or not this book is something that's worthy of a book report. Okay, but it takes a very long time to make a similar assessment of a game. And one of the things that we've been talking with game manufacturers about in the UK is just making a little synopsis available for teachers so that you don't have to invest the days of play in a complex game to begin to understand it before you can decide whether or not it has some value in your classroom and whether or not it's a legitimate cultural artifact, if you like. And I think that's something that people are starting to respond to in the UK. I'm not talking about major work here. It is literally just a small synopsis that explains what's going on. And things like, if you've got one of the very popular games I know here as well is things like Roller Coaster Tycoon. Just a little bit about the economic models that are in there. Do they in fact relate to anything you might want to teach in business studies, or are they completely off the wall and unique to the game? And if you know that they're using legitimate models in the game, then you are much more comfortable about using it in a business studies class. Now, clearly, with just released stuff or about to be released stuff, people are very nervous about that kind of information. But we're now having some quite sane conversations with EA, for example, about stuff that's been out there for some time because they're no longer so twitched about it. Because as far as they're concerned, they've made all the money they're going to make out of it in the commercial market. It's old stuff sitting on the shelf. But for schools, it still has a lot of mileage. So, those conversations about just making the artifacts more accessible for teachers without the days of investment, I think can make quite a difference.
Okay, let's go way in the back and then we'll come back up here.
Karen Michelson, the comment about the technology personnel at the school really struck me because we found that we did teacher workshops, they'd go back to the school with a tech coordinator and say, you can't do that. So now we bring the tech coordinators in as well and give them, I think, for 2 days of the same training so that they're confident with what the materials are that the teachers are going to be doing.
Okay, so the comment is that not only the teachers, but the tech coordinators, schools are institutions after all, and that's part of the changing culture of schools. Okay, Celia, did you have something?
Yeah, Celia Pierce from UC Irvine. I wanted to also kind of shift the discussion a little bit towards something that Henry mentioned earlier about media production. And I think there's some really interesting opportunities. For instance, I worked on a proposal about 2 years ago to use The Sims to make sets for Shakespeare plays. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for creativity and media production, things like machinima, that can also be used in the classroom in lieu of,
Good.
in lieu of writing a paper, making a game or creating a game mod, for example, on a particular subject.
Okay, so does anybody, the production aspect of games, the modding, the machina, the various things people can do, comments on that?
Yeah. That would be great.
In fact, based on that notion, there is a product now called MediaStage, which has been developed by a commercial company in the UK, which allows you to generate. It's difficult to describe them really because they are a new medium, but they are in effect stage productions in a virtual space, and that software is really going down a storm, and it's an interesting crossover product in a way because in one sense, it's not a game, it's a toy in that it's a play environment, but it is absolutely spectacular in terms of learning about staging a production. And you get the way that the projects have worked is you have teams of kids, some of whom are writers, some of whom are directors, some of whom are characters, but it goes beyond what you can do in just making a stage play. And interestingly, going back to this point about colonizing kids' free time, the fascinating thing about that is, unlike a school play where you have to physically all be together, or at least in some kind of group to do any work on it, the kids, of course, once they're in the virtual environment, they're spending every spare minute voluntarily working on these creations. So it's a very nice product.
So somebody has the mic there. Okay.
I have the power. Linda Poland. I think there's a deeper issue, or at least as I've seen childhood in my household and in my kids' friends' households, and in the Pokemon gym to which we both belong. And that is that school is for children my daughter's age, she's 11, is a very slow, linear experience. And game playing, both on video, online, or with cards, is a very fast, multitasked experience. And I'm not sure the two cultures can be pulled together in a way that doesn't compromise one or the other. And I know certainly for her, Pokemon is banned largely at the school, largely because of the economic gray market and concerns about what might happen between classes. But I think it's important to consider school as a culture unto itself, and the gaming experience of children is a very different experience.
But there is the trouble that today schools, American schools, more than any other country, are categorizing more and more kids with ADHD and learning disabilities, so many that they'll be the majority soon. And a lot of those kids just have a virus from school, because they know that 19th century form of learning is dead for them. It was dead for a lot of people for a long time anyway. So we may be seeing the last moments. The other thing I want to say about the colonizing kids outside school, this is some kids, research already shows this, upper middle class kids' popular culture is already being colonized by their parents to accelerate them. 2-year-olds have got the mouse. They're already playing Civilization with the parent. The upper middle class homes know very well, and when we did interviews, we found this when we interviewed teenagers. They'd say they did very well in school, but they'd say the stuff I'm learning at home with my digital technologies is what's going to prepare my future, and school's going to give me a certificate that allows me to have that future. That's an equity problem. All right. Whoever has the mic now has the power. Okay, so you don't need me.
I guess this is kind of in response to that comment. My name's Ramon Dela Cruz. I'm getting my master's in education right now in Portland, Oregon, student teaching in a middle school. And what I'm seeing is, based on my own middle school experience when I was a kid, going through that very linear, this is the way school is, this is what it goes, you have 7 classes a day and that kind of thing. And now I'm involved in a school where I have one class of 28 kids all day, every day, and it's 6th, 7th, and 8th graders all mixed together, and we have periods. Sometimes if something works, we can extend the period. Sometimes if it's not working, we can cut it short and go out for recess, depending. And really, school is, for these kids, it's just that, like, the middle of their adolescent development where they really, really need a very loose structure, and these kids can go out and we can run around and we can get excited and we can yell and dance around and jump around, and it really is becoming a game-like environment. And I think it's still very, very flawed and experimental in its situation. It's a K through 8 environmental program, so we have all sorts of age groups in there too, and it's really just new and on the cutting edge, and people are saying we're brainwashing kids and things, but really we're providing an environment where it's wonderful, and we get to see games play of all sorts, where kids will come in and be able to talk about video games is kind of the new thing with a lot of people unwilling to accept it, but we'll play board games, we'll play Scrabble in Spanish, we'll play Risk in a history class, and it ties it all in. And I think we're slowly seeing, hopefully, in some cases, kind of the ravine close up. I guess there are a lot of alternatives that seem to be, coming about, and it's just, it's exciting.
Can I ask a question about your school? Is it a private school, or what's the demographic?
No, it's part of Portland Public School District, and it's the Sunnyside Environmental Schools, what it's called now, and it's a K through 8. We have field trip travel days once a week. We go all over town on the buses. We have a lot of environmental focus, and this is part of what, there are articles that have been written recently. There was a huge blow up, but saying that we're brainwashing and damaging the next generation of kids.
You're on the right track.
We're letting kids be kids in school, and it's, I don't know, it's like, why fight what kids are going to do if they're going to do it anyway and try and make it fun? I don't know. Anyway.
Okay, when we bring the mic down, oh, there's somebody already back there. You guys in front.
I see. My question is directed at Ms. Ito. With your studies with, forgive me, Yu-Gi-Oh? How do you say it? Yu-Gi-Oh. Does the proliferation of like the story world through this media mix you speak of provide an increased sense of agency and story economy within the user?
I'm sorry.
Increased or decreased?
Increased. I'm curious whether, it provides these kids with a feeling of connectivity with the story that they wouldn't have if it was provided to them through one media.
Yeah, no, I think it's I didn't talk about too much, but I think Pokemon was absolutely revolutionary in that sense because it took a game interaction as the narrative frame so that the player was authoring an individual viewpoint through the space and that kids were watching the show for game strategy. They were developing their own identifications. Now with Pokemon, there aren't as many game characters to identify with, but Yu-Gi-Oh has a few more, and then they started releasing custom decks that were keyed to particular characters. So they're slowly moving in the direction of realizing that it doesn't have to be a good guy and bad guy and sidekick, that there's actually, you can have a pantheon of, thousands of characters and character combinations that kids can manipulate to figure out their own personalized trajectory through the narrative space. So I think it's kind of a form of alternative storytelling that's happening, but maybe not in the ways that, that's been necessarily thought of or theorized in the, in the electronic game space.
Hi, my name is Lang Bang. I am a child psychiatrist at the Baylor College of Medicine, and I'm particularly interested in video gaming and education because I was not to change the subject from the classroom, but also move video games into my therapy room and play therapy and sorts of education, social interaction with kids who have more severe sorts of illnesses like autism. And I wanted to get the panels and maybe the group's opinion on that.
Any opinions on games and therapy, including autism?
Gee, I don't.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm really way beyond my area of experience now. But there's a really interesting group at the University of Cambridge in the UK, run by a guy called Baron Cohen, who incidentally is Ali G's brother, but we won't hold that against him. And they're using, they're not exactly gaming environments, but they are using digital environments with autistic kids to help them learn to recognize different expressions of different emotions. And there's a lot of stuff. The key software is called mind reading, and there is a lot of stuff on the web about it, but you may know about that. But he's... One of his most famous quotes is that autism is the ultimate expression of the male brain. But he said that, not me.
True. Wherever the mic goes, we've got to go. The mic died.
Anyway, my name's Ted Henning, and inspired by last year's Education Arcade, I created something we're just creating now, BrainMeld.org, which is a group that's meant to both increase teachers' games literacy and help them give them skills to actually bring entertainment games into the classroom, but also teach a course at National University's Graduate School of Education about using games in the classroom. And I think one of the things that I found really interesting in the first week of the course, basically I had teachers play games, right? And there's a range of teachers from hate games to games knowledgeable. But invariably, every teacher who plays games in this course, they go into the classroom and they mention to their kids, And all of a sudden, all the kids light up, and this new line of communication starts instantly. Even if you don't bring the game into the classroom and use it, all of a sudden, there's this connection that makes with the kids, and the communication starts, and the kids, invariably the kids that never speak will walk up to the teacher after class and say, this is my, game, why don't you use this? And it's an amazing thing, just to start this line of communication. And, I don't know if I have a question. I just wanted to sort of share that because it's sort of outside of the specific thing we're talking about.
That's interesting.
Yeah, we've seen the same thing with classrooms, for example, teachers dealing with emotionally disabled kids or other kids where this is an area where they feel control, expertise, and where they're knowers. And when the teacher connects to that knowledge, you can change the identity work of those children. And I've seen that happen. I think it's a powerful thing to do.
Cole Lazaro from Zio Design. I'll get the mic right. And we do player experience design consulting for game companies. And my question to the panel was, I came last year, and one of the interesting takeaways I had from that year was that games have a lot of potential, but then there's also maybe not for everybody. And do you have any experience of where games might be, if we introduce a book into a classroom, or peer-to-peer networking is a good thing because you need to do that later on in life. You don't necessarily need to master games. Is there a downside to bringing games into the classroom, as far as some people might be turned off because they just don't like games, or does everybody, literally 100% of kids, really like games as a way of engaging with content?
Well, that's why I don't advocate that what we should be pushing is games into classrooms. We should be pushing the powerful learning principles that are in popular culture, whether it's Yu-Gi-Oh! Or games, the way it's motivating people and how they're built, the structured design to get learning done. Games should be part of that mix with other stuff. So we should be talking about the learning system. One of the things games do, interesting enough, which kind of answers your question, is very good games allow different ways to learn, different styles of play, customization. So it'd be kind of absurd then to say, let's have everybody do it the same way, because one of the key principles games realize is it's got to partly be your way, and it's got to partly have alternative solutions. So no, I don't think every kid or every soldier learns by a game, but I think the real message is we need a multimodal mix of learning. But one thing is, I think everybody, it is true of most people we know from research, for example, that they do not learn well by just getting thousands of words out of any context. A 500-page textbook or lectures after lectures completely untied to what the words refer to. That is the experience, the dialogue experience. Now, games never do that, right? They always give you language and other symbols tied to the experiences you're going to have, the dialogue and the action. Now, that seems to me just a general principle that schools have violated for about 100 years, right? But any other takers on this?
Yeah. Well, it's not an entirely serious point, but if we excluded things from the school curriculum because A, you weren't going to do them in later life, and B, not everybody was good at them, there wouldn't be a lot left, really. But I think but I think Jim's absolutely right that it's to do with the mix. But it also, one of my kind of day job really is much more to do with mainstream educational technology, and which has of course completely failed to deliver any of the things that it was promised it would deliver. And this huge gap between what the technology could offer to learning theoretically and what it does offer, and this notion of allowing different people to approach something in a different way is something that you almost never see in educational media. It could be there, and gaming environments show very clearly how it could be there, but it's just not. And even products where they will tell you that it's there, actually it isn't. It's just a different route through the same kind of stuff. So I think that's another of the things that we could learn about the use of technology to support learning that games have got right. Is that genuine support of people who assimilate information differently.
Do I really need the mic? Yeah. I really do? Okay, I thought I could wing it. But anyways, I'm Jeremiah McCall. I teach history at Cincinnati Country Day School. I just wanted to comment, really. One thing that I don't think has been stressed, and I don't want to steal my thunder on a later panel, but teaching in high school anyways, all of the subjects that we teach are disciplines, and I think sometimes teachers forget that these disciplines are fundamentally active in their origins. I mean, anybody who does graduate level work in history or physics or anything like that realizes that even if they're not moving in their chair, they're intellectually active. They're asking questions, they are forming reconstructions of reality. So it seems to me, and sort of building on what Jim had said before, it seems to me what you need to do to integrate games more fully into the classroom, or at least into the high school classroom, is to have teachers in general be more aware of the discipline side of their studies. So rather than thinking so much about the content that needs to be mastered, think about the actual skills and processes that need to be done to be a junior historian or a junior physicist. That's what I try to do in my classroom, is have my kids engage primary sources on a deep and interactive level. Games fit in very well with that then as reconstructions of reality. And the Racing Academy game that you showed, I think, is a great example of, if you remember that there is an active discipline involved rather than simply just a body of content, I think games can play a much better role in the classroom.
I think this is where we get to this previous comment, the tension between skill and drill, because another way to put this is an academic domain is a game itself. You need to know the rules of the type of science you're doing. So just the way in which in playing a game, part of it is learning the rules and then learning what emergent properties those rules give you. That's the same in learning science. I was at a game conference recently where people were talking about a science game they had done, and a little kid said at the end of it, it was the first time in his schooling career he had felt like a scientist in doing science. Well, there's a view of science to say that he's never done science before in school. If being a scientist is doing and taking on a value system and identity and not the facts. And I think that's the central tension. And the great thing that games can do is reintroduce these domains as activities with identities and values.
I guess, just building on that, but also sort of stressing some of the tensions with doing that in an educational context. I mean, in contrast to what you see with kids who have developed their own native forms of assessment and reputation building, it's not a simulation of a professional identity, but it's a real identity that matters within their peer group. I'm not saying that that isn't replicable in the school context, but I do want to stress that there is something fundamentally different about that, which is really about, I think, that the comment about assessment, it coming back to assessment and accountability, that the accountability structure of school, I think it's extremely difficult to break out of that, because what you have, like with fanzine production, for example, is the accountability is getting the product done. And you get a distributed system of expertise where no individual knows everything that needs to be done. So it's not like, I'm going to play the role of a physicist who's an expert and knows what I need to know about physics. It's like, no, I'm going to be the person who does the subtitling. I'm going to be the person who knows the Japanese or whatever. Like, these fan sub-communities are a really good example of that. When anime is brought overseas, it's like these kids learn Japanese, they learn video editing, they learn animation. It's a distributed, team-based enterprise. They get the job done much more effectively than the professional translators do. But if you tested these kids along individual variables, no one of them could get this done. So the whole structure of schooling is based on individualized assessment and people occupying a particular identity that's being assessed, rather than this much more organic, peer-based reputation system where you know who to call to get a job done, and which is probably much closer to how people work. But we have no way of institutionalizing that, especially given the current political climate around.
I think we should keep in mind, though, that some of this is relatively new. The most successful school reform done in the United States was Debbie Meyer's work in the East Harlem schools, where she introduced a new curriculum in the 80s, and these are almost all African-American kids, and over 92% of them went on to college. Most successful thing ever done, and that's exactly the model it was built on. Kids produced in distributed knowledge projects, and then had to present it by adult standards to adults who belong to that community. It was enormously successful. It was killed by this current round of stuff. So we have done it, and we can do it. It's not inevitable that we have to do what we're doing.
One of the things that I think is one of the worst policy crimes, actually, is to create an environment where we've almost forgotten that testing is not all there is to assessment.
Right.
So there are people now who genuinely believe that if you have the kind of collaborative project working that Mimi's just described, you can no longer assess individuals. Well, that's just not true, actually. And as Jim says, we do. If you go back far enough in our culture, we do know how to do that. And there's no point pretending that we will ever get to a point where a school system to satisfy social needs won't need to somehow grade at the individual level. But you don't have to sit tests to assess whether an individual is making progress in a collaborative environment. And that's the key thing. We have to get back to assessing kids' learning rather than testing what they as an individual can do in a locked room with paper and pencil. And that's, we are actually making some progress now on policy in the UK at that level. And if you're at all interested, in the UK we have an organisation, a government agency called the Qualification and Curriculum Agency, the QCA, and they have an area on their website at the moment called Futures, and it's a blue sky project, and it is completely rethinking the way in which we validate learning in a school context. And I am optimistic that some good stuff will come from that. And there is a history that, these kinds of assessment models, when they come out of the UK, do tend to kind of reverberate round, whether they're good or bad, unfortunately. So I am optimistic that there is a possibility of change, if not in the immediate future, then in the medium term.
So I think we have time for one more question out here in front, unless somebody's got the mic. Oh, wait, somebody else had the mic back there. Oh, my David, I'm sorry. I took you. Geez, now I'm in real trouble.
Disrupted
He'll
the
get you
power
later.
He can get back at me.
later.
The rest of you can't. Wow.
Hi, my name is Christopher Hartz. My background is in military simulation and training, which has done both gaming and simulation in the classroom for decades. It's a given. In fact, the interest right now is in games for outside the classroom after school is completed, in the field or at home. You mentioned Media Stage as an example of sort of a thing to build with. Have you seen any other games or environments for learning outside of the classroom as homework or assignments?
There are a few products, and in fact Media Stage is one where, as I say, where the idea is that the work goes on beyond. But I think it's a very underexploited area, and it's one of the things that make, there are several things that make me very annoyed about people whose business is software. Firstly, that the education market is not a sustainable market in and of itself. Now, in the UK, which is considerably smaller than the United States, we spend about £250 million on educational technology for the school systems a year. I'm sorry, but that is actually a viable market. That's the first thing. The other thing is, if you only think about selling one product to each school, then of course it's not a viable market. But if you're thinking about selling a product to the school and then into the 30 homes of every kid in the class as a take home, then you're looking at a very, very different market. And in fact, I've worked on products of that kind myself, and they're very, very successful. I've had parents queuing at the school gate saying, please tell me where I can get the software that my kid can take home, because he's talking about nothing else and she's talking about nothing else, and I really want to get this so we can take it home. But the key block there actually is not so much the developers. Publishers really find trouble getting their head around that, because they are so into niche marketing and segmented audiences that the idea that you could have a product that goes across more than one is just too much for them to deal with. So, there are, the business models are actually perfectly viable if people have the imagination to see them.
Okay, thank you very much.